Hi everyone. Welcome back to another episode of this campaign against the integrated system plan. Today it's the turn of the Australian Energy Regulator. I'm going to be focusing my attention on them. As I said, it's necessary when trying to get the ISP basically revoked and declare why it's sort of worse than useless to turn to all the instances and all the institutions that have basically enabled it to become the worse than useless thing it is today. The critical people that have provided defense for it, nurtured it into becoming something that is so bad and is so badly damaged our debate. And the regulator is one of those. So necessary to go there. And this particular chapter is going to be it is simultaneously one of the hardest to tell and one of the easiest to tell in terms of coming to the conclusion that there need to be resignations. The hard part is that it's just such a complex, massive story. It's deep in regulation. There's like a whole bunch of complexity that you could go for any one of dozens of instances of behaviors that you think are not really worthwhile or have damaged trust, basically. In the regulator, and so that's hard to pick out one instance to really hang your hat on and say here is a charge that I think really sticks, and so I'm going to do that with a little bit of color, a little bit of support material as well to sort of establish this is not a sort of a cherry-picked isolated example but part of a trend that you can and should dig into. The easy bit is trying to figure out the gravity of it and whether this is sort of resignation worthy. This case is pretty easy. It doesn't feel particularly bad at all because the trust, like the bar is set so high for a regulator. They're our enforcement agency. They are literally the police force that governs or enforces all the rules that are set out to govern energy. And so trust is absolutely just so key to what they do that the bar is high. Poor behavior shouldn't be accepted. Any breach of trust there is really, really serious. And what I think that they have done in this case that I want to focus on mostly is pretty low. Not only have they just not enforced the rules, which is their job, that is their only main job, but they have come back and lied persistently about why those rules didn't need to be enforced. And that's low. I think that's seriously low. I can't think of many good reasons. Look, I can't think of any good reasons for any kind of enforcement agency for not enforcing the rules. There could be some. They can't go after every tiny little trivial offence, all right? Resources are finite. The police don't chase down every instance of jaywalking they might come across, whatever. But for serious things maybe there's reasons, perhaps, if you're trying to turn an informant or something like that to cut a deal. But when someone just walks up to you and says, look, hey, we want to break this rule. Is that okay with you? I can't think of many good reasons why it would be okay for the enforcement agency to say, yeah, go ahead, break the rule. But what I really can't excuse is lying about it afterwards. That is a serious erosion of trust. I can think of no good reasons why I wouldn't expect truth and honesty from our enforcement agencies. And that's, I think, the big problem that we see here today. So I'll do my best to tell that story. Just to emphasize before I move on, though, this is not an isolated instance. There is just so much on the record here that I could go on all night, all day, trying to tell the full story. I would really urge you, though, to go and look at the Centre for Independent Studies YouTube channel and look for the video with Zoe talking about can we trust the energy transition. That is a compact and very well presented 20 minutes telling a big part of this story and gives you a whole range of different instances to look at. So that I'd really urge you to consider that. Almost quasi-essential pre-reading or previewing to kind of really make sense of this kind of story here. But I'll do my very best to kind of hit the most important points sufficiently clearly to, I think, land the key conclusion, which is the position of the regulator at the moment is untenable. They have not behaved in ways that build, and I think, a becoming of the trust that we require to have in them to represent our interests and discharge their statutory duties. Before I try to tell that story, a quick recap and quick update. So why are we here? How did we get here? What am I doing? This crazy sort of thing, throwing around allegations, calling for resignations. It seems extreme, and it absolutely is. So a bit over a week ago, Saturday before the one that gone by, I put out a video on X, basically declaring that the ISP was not worth rescuing. It had to be burned to the waterline and sunk, and a new one refloated. It had to be repudiated from the highest levels by the market operator in order for us to restore a civil facts-based debate and prevent worse abuse of government agencies and worse damage to the reputation of these authorities that we have in place. So, dramatic call. That was well on the way to becoming my most popular X post ever by Monday, and then my Twitter account X got hacked, and I lost control of the account. I haven't yet been able to get it back again, but the following day I just moved on to YouTube, which is where I still am now, trying to basically continue to prosecute the case and explain in detail fully why trust has been so badly broken and why the ISP must be removed from its current position. So just to kind of recap the very, very bare minimums, the straw that absolutely broke the camel's back for the integrated system plan's credibility, not the only thing, there's many critical flaws, but the thing that makes its position untenable, totally indefensible at the moment, is the inclusion of the 82% renewable energy target as a binding constraint in every scenario that the ISP uses for its important regulatory function and all the marketing and spin that goes with it. Why is that just so bad? Why is that a disaster? Well, two things. Firstly, the origin of the number. Where did the 82% came from? The 82% came from the Labor Party commissioned report that was produced by Reputex, right? This is back before they got elected in 2021. And in that report, it wasn't a policy to aim for 82%. 82% was one of the things that was just meant to flow from policy. It was an outcome of policy, a projection. And it belongs in exactly the same table. You can look at it at figure 1 in the executive summary of that report. It is a twin number with the now famous $275 reduction in your energy bills that was meant to be done by 2025. Guess what? It's 2025. And so we have this situation now where a projected outcome of policy, the real policy is rewiring the nation, a projected outcome that is the total laughing stock, right? The absolute laughing stock of policy credibility in Australia. That's one number. But the same number that came from exactly the same provenance, produced by the same people, modelling the same policy, 82% renewable energy, meant to be a consequence of policy, has now become not just enshrined in policy, but locked in the integrated system plan in such a way that it is essentially unassailable. It is now not considered that anything other than the achievement of that policy could occur. This is absurd. Utterly extreme, because the provenance of that number is absolutely in disrepute, and yet the market operator has basically wrapped it in all the shrouds and the trappings of the most official, most objective seeming analysis that we do, and made it essentially an accomplished fact in the debate. A couple of consequences. Firstly, it is absolutely distorts our regulatory process because we're forced to invest prematurely in heaps of projects that we will not need because that target will not be met. So that's a disaster for consumers. And the first resignation I called for was that of Grant King. And Grant basically was part of the organisations that gave, I suppose, a veil of credibility to 82% through his advice as chair of the Climate Change Authority. And then when that helped one of these very dubious projects, HumeLink, limp through the regulatory process to get $5 billion basically added to the asset base of Transgrid, he walked right across and then took the chairmanship of that company as soon as that policy had been accepted and done its deed, essentially, to get HumeLink approved. I think it doesn't pass the sniff test. I don't allege that he knew or intended that to occur, but it is just kind of, absolutely indefensible in terms of the optics of that, and I think he should resign. Second thing that's the consequence of this 82% that is an absolute unmitigated disaster is that our debate has been totally and utterly debased. By setting such a benchmark and wrapping all this credibility around it, like, it is now impossible to have a sensible debate that queries whether we are on the right path by actually assessing what a realistic baseline is. Because there's no realistic baseline in the ISP anymore. So that's an absolute disaster. And I called for the resignation of Matt Keane. Matt Keane, who's the current chair of the Climate Change Authority, in a most absolutely spectacular case of, I think, abusing public office and definitely abusing a terrible misunderstanding of the integrated system plan, came out and again just battered away all the critiques that are exactly on this topic by basically asserting, oh no, the integrated system plan, it's tried everything else, it's tested everything else. When in fact it hasn't tested compared to nuclear, hasn't tested compared to more coal. It is only assumed that every government policy is an accomplished fact. The footage of that is just, it's, once you've had the scales fall from your eyes, it is honestly moving and horrifying. If he knew what he was doing, he was lying to Parliament furiously. If he didn't, again, I just can't see his positions any more tenable, because he's got no idea how the integrated system plan works, and he's extremely confident in it working the way he thinks it works. And someone who's extremely confident about something they're extremely wrong on is totally dangerous to have in high government office. And he is in high government office, chair of the Climate Change Authority, on something where that topic is absolutely key and core. So, no, I have had absolutely no reconsideration. Those resignations are absolutely necessary. And I think that the rest of the story will build and provide more of the picture as to why they are called for. But to kind of clarify and address any potential criticism of why such an extreme and continued sort of campaign is necessary, why go to war, right? Why the war language? Lots of people say, like, oh, it just sounds so ridiculous and, a bit over the top. Look, the simple fact of the matter is that we have been goaded, and when I say we, anyone trying to question the underlying facts and assumptions have basically been dismissed, like Matt Keane and like Tim Ayres as well, who basically called Ross Goodell a cooker and conspiracy theorist before trying to retract it, right, from Hansard, whatever. But like, that is what we're threatened with. If you question this information, if you question anything about the assumptions, which desperately need questioning, because they haven't, the assumptions come from a different place than most people think, right? So then you're questioning the experts. How dare you distrust the experts? And basically, what's required now, it's essential that someone come out and say, you know what? Yes, I don't trust the experts. And I'm doing that. That's what my first video was. And it is not something that can be done by halves. You can't go out and do that in hushed tones and just sort of utter it as though you're not particularly confident in it. And so you have to make the full case and explain properly why you don't trust the experts. And because so much of the trust before, right? And again, remember the 82%, the trust was, the claim given to us was that, oh no, we're just doing this because the rules force us to. We're just following the rules. That was the basis for trust, that they were doing everything right. That's been blown away. FOI evidence has shown that they actually proposed not making that a binding constraint. They weren't constrained by the rules, and they proposed and intended otherwise until the government expressed a preference. So we can't trust AEMO when they say they're just following the rules. And when they're not following the rules, in this cases, when they're definitely not following the rules, and it's part of the story today, they say, oh, don't worry, trust us, we've consulted with the regulator, everything is fine. So it's crucial that someone comes out and makes this full-throated argument that we don't trust the experts. The trust is broken now, badly broken. And it's impossible to do that whilst just trying to make a narrow attack on the ISP or AEMO. Because all of the trust and all the faith they've claimed is said, no, trust us, we're following the rules, trust us, we've talked to the regulator, and so it is necessary to basically expand and escalate and say, well, can we trust the regulator in doing that function diligently? And look, in a perfectly kind of geeky, nerdy kind of way, this is exactly a perfect description of war, right? When your vital interests, your absolutely vital interests are compromised. And I think it's a vital interest that we have a safe civic space for an evidence-based debate and analysis of energy without being called liars or conspiracy theorists. When we can't do that, we must get it back. When all other means are totally exhausted, when we've tried to ask through every other formal submission channel, and that hasn't worked, when the trust is so deeply broken, and that you can't get your approach, even through desperate measures, keeping a narrow tack because, oh, there's a defensive bulwark on one side, like, oh, I've got an ally here that blocks that excuse, can't trust us, look, the regulator's here to protect us, they've got a right flank, definitely can't come that way. It is necessary to escalate and broaden the conflict in order to be able to reach and reclaim your most vital interests. So that's a weird kind of geeky analysis, I know, but I think war describes the situation that we're in, which helps me address this second question. Why resignations? Again, it sounds extreme. And the simple answer to that is because I don't want war. I don't want to stay in a state of war. It's ridiculous that we've got here. And it's the first way of proposing peace. Basically, it's terms for peace. We're declaring the trust is deeply, deeply, badly broken, trying to point to the specific instances that justify that and tell a clear story. We can't avoid risking impugning motives. You can't say, hey, the trust is broken, this looks horrendous and indefensible, without there being the possibility that it looks like something bad has happened, right? And I think basically I could point out all these facts that look like the market operator and the regulator and the market commission are no longer doing their job, no longer looking after consumers, might be influenced by something else, might be more interested in defending a government narrative, might be more interested in trying to support the interests of Transgrid to get their asset base knocked up a few $1 billion as fast as possible. These are not proper interests, but I'm doing my best, and I think I've tripped over myself in previous videos with so many cautious conniptions, like do my best to do as little to avoid impugning motives wherever possible. And I think when laying out the facts that look sufficiently bad, it's necessary to, I suppose, land on the most generous interpretation, which I think is always that what has happened looks so bad, looks like a sufficient breach of trust that the position of the current leadership is untenable, which is a call for resignation. So extreme, I know, highly unconventional, but I think absolutely necessary. And if I was to lay out these facts and not land on a kind of, I think the right action is this, then I'd be immediately accused of something. What are you implying? Like, you're accusing them of conspiracy? Like, I'm accusing them of ending up in an untenable position for institutions that require a very high degree of trust. The trust is broken. The trust is broken. That's the message that has to get through. And if anyone else feels like repeating that, that's kind of my battle cry. Anyone else that can kind of wants to join and make an indication of support, wherever you think suitable. Do you trust the experts? We'd love to, but the trust is broken. And this is how. So now how do we get to this kind of question about the regulator? What's happened here? Firstly, minimum setup, I hope. Is this on some tiny little corner of some obscure project that does not matter, that's not important to the narrative or the debate at all? Not at all. The particular instance that the regulator is lying about now is absolutely front and center to, I think, the very, very key and most core narrative important questions to the energy debate. It centers, frankly, around Snowy 2.0, right? When Snowy 2.0, which is a massive pumped hydro storage project, was first proposed, it was a thought of Malcolm Turnbull. He proposed it. There was a perfectly opaque and not particularly compelling business case put up, and it was plagued with criticism at the time. The key thing about Snowy 2.0 is that Snowy 2.0 is kind of bang in the middle of the mountains, the highest mountains in Australia. They're sort of bang in the middle between our two biggest population centres. There's Melbourne, Sydney. It's really nowhere near any other proposed generation. All the big renewable energy generation is meant to happen out west of New South Wales and western Victoria. A straight line between Melbourne and Sydney does go kind of near Snowy 2.0, but it goes nowhere near where this kind of link out to VI West is currently planned to do. So Malcolm Turnbull, and in the proposal Snowy 2.0, basically said that there is no way that they're going to agree for the federal government, who is ramming this project through, to also accept responsibility for the massive transmission lines to connect it up. They said, that's fine. Push that onto the usual regulatory process. It'll pay for it. It'll have benefits. Let's just see how that goes. Basically, the usual regulatory process is struggling to approve them. And in fact, I think it's exactly this story that I'm talking about now, where the normal regulatory process is being stretched and abused. Like, they're trying to basically bang a square peg into a round hole so hard that the honesty and integrity, like, that's what is demanding the breaches of trust, trying to get these projects that don't stack up, never would, through the regulatory process. A weird analogy I know is like, imagine that a government's hypothetical kind of key policy initiative for energy was a nuclear power plant, right? And one of the necessary complexities of nuclear power plant is its waste. I mean, imagine if they just sort of said, oh, look, no, we'll pay for the nuclear power plant. We'll get that running. But no, the waste, usual processes. Just call up the local council and, like, tell them what you got, and, like, they'll send you an appropriate fee. It'll take care of itself. Don't worry. We don't have to underwrite that. Like, that'd be absurd, right? Like, the type of waste that nuclear power plants produce is of a totally different character to what every other industrial or residential normal waste is. And it is not fair to just assume that normal processes take care of that. So the right thing to do is to basically incorporate it in the special project and make sure that it adds up, including taking care of the mess that it makes. And I think for nuclear, that's done. And I think it does add up still. And it can and could and should be progressed. But for renewable energies and the Snowy 2.0 project, like, this is a perfect example of the difficulty of renewables. Everything is so far flung and interdependent. The generation, the storage, the cities, none of them are close together. And so you end up in this massive everything, everywhere, all at once kind of infrastructure build. And the really expensive bit is the spaghetti network of transmission to try to link it all together. This is of a totally different quantum, the transmission problem, to what you get for synchronous controllable generators that you can kind of choose when they operate and choose a bit where they operate to. This is different. The system, the purposes we have now are being abused, utterly abused wholesale, I think, to try to basically ram through and protect the legacy of a project that was a thought bubble, probably a brain fart. I don't even know anyone else in the very few people in the very pro-renewable sector that still thinks snowy hydro is a very good idea. This kind of extremely deep storage is the last thing you build in the energy transition, and we're building it the first. And our energy system and all the planners and regulators are acting as though there is no way to possibly critique any decision that a government has previously made. And I think that it's got to the point that that's now disgraceful. So that's what this story is about. The other way of highlighting how important this story is that it is absolutely right at the centre of HumeLink, this project that is the biggest transmission project that is costed in the ISP. There are others that are treated as sunk costs, don't get me started, but HumeLink is huge, and it's the first cab off the rank. It's approaching $5 billion. And this is exactly the project that I've previously called for the resignation of the chairman, because he gave his signature on an instrumental piece of advice that transitioned this hopeful idea of 82% renewables into official policy that made it ironclad in the regulatory process, which was instrumental in getting HumeLink through that regulatory process and giving Transgrid $5 billion. So it is ground zero for the energy debate, whichever way you care to measure it. And so, and by the way, also, slight aside, Transgrid, which is the company at the center of this, they'll be building big parts of VNI West as well. They did not appear before the Energy Planning and Regulation in Australia Senate Select Committee. So we've just had a massive kind of show and tell. It's barely scratched the surface of what needs to be told here. But Transgrid did not appear. There is absolutely no way that I think the air can be cleared until a serious investigation of Transgrid and their relationship with the regulators is undertaken. And I think that looks like a royal commission. And so that's one of the consequences. I think it's absolutely open. I thought I'd throw it out there. A royal commission to clear the air is absolutely required. And I hope that anyone of any stripe, absolutely any flavour in politics, agrees with me, including Labor, including in particular people that have pegged their identity on integrity. Like being in renewables does not mean that no one could be beyond a profit motive inducing bad actions. So it should be essential that any bad actors are weeded out. I'm doing my best not to accuse Transgrid doing anything improper, but look, the things that have happened, and again, I'd refer to that CIS video, look pretty appalling to me. So I'll continue to the nub of the story. Where was this lie? What was this lie about? This lie was about a skipped consultation. A consultation that is absolutely, definitely required by the national electricity rules. All right, so I'll describe it to you just super briefly. The relevant clause says in the rules, it's 5.22.15c, it says, AEMO must consult on new information and the impact on the optimal development path under the integrated system plan in accordance with details. So what does that mean? How do we simply understand this? The new information they must consult on, actually, that's not what they must consult on. New information can include, by the way, a price change, which there was a massive one before the last ISP. There was a massive increase in the cost of HumeLink. It blew out another roughly 50%. All right. It can also include new policy change or any inputs to the assumptions and projections that are in the ISP. All right. Policy change. There was a massive new inclusion, this 82%. Right. So these are the things that are the inputs. But the requirement here, the requirement of the rules, is not just consult on new information. In fact, that's not this requirement. You're meant to consult on the impact on the optimal development path. All right. The impact on the optimal development path is what must be consulted on in this instance here. And this instance here is to do an update. I'm really sorry, by the way, if this is a little bit rambly. I normally would like to lay this out in perfect detail with all the right screenshots and a nice tight script, but that takes months, and there's an election coming, and I want this to be done and dusted before there's an election so that we can get on with the proper civil debate and understand and rebuild trust that's required in our institutions. So doing my best here. So it's the impact of the inputs on the output that is the optimal development path that must be consulted on. Simple analogy, if you're having a cooking competition, The inputs are the ingredients, all right? Lined up on the bench, all right? Your butter, flour, eggs, sugar, vanilla essence, whatever else you think goes into the cake or dish you're cooking, right? The output is when you've mixed it all together in your special, careful way and baked it or something like that. Finished the process to see what comes out, what's the final output. This rule is crystal clear that the consultations required is not just on what goes in, but the impact of what goes in on what comes out. That is what's required. And you can see why this is absolutely crucial, right? This was the first bite at the apple for us to see what the consequences were of us blindly assuming that in every scenario, 82% gets met. There are hundreds of thousands, tables of other inputs. It takes time and effort to sort through all the documentation. There's thousands and thousands of pages of it to figure out what actually mattered. What was the binding constraint? Who actually benefited? And this is just absolutely crucial if you wanted to answer a question, for example, say, is there a particular company that got a $5 billion windfall from a particular bit of advice that went into a policy that suddenly appeared as a policy constraint in the ISP? To answer that question, which I think is important because I've called for resignation about that, you must consult on not just the inputs, but the impact of those inputs on the output. And so the rule is good. It's there for a very sensible reason. It's really quite important, I think. And so what happened, right? Basically, this consultation was skipped. So to try to sort of tell you a little bit of the background, it wasn't even clear. The market operator sent around an email on the 17th of November saying that they were going to release two things simultaneously. They did not call out that was basically the draft ISP, that it had no consultation, and then simultaneously do an update. And there's meant to be this consultation between those two things. You can't just do an update to the ISP, because when you update an ISP, when that update is in force, then you can basically start handing out the cash to these major projects, right? Then it has force in the regulatory process, a process called the feedback loop, and you can start handing out cash. And so that gap between those two, where there's a consultation, is absolutely crucial. The market operator sent out an email saying, we're going to do these two things together. And they did not flag that there was a rule that they were breaking to do these things together. They just said that they've consulted with the Australian Energy Regulator to develop a workable process to update the 2022 ISP in a timely way. Flagging the regulator. Don't ask questions. Nothing to see here. Everything above board, right? Trust us. We're referring to the regulator. They're all with us on this, right? So we have to ask this question now, right? Do we trust the regulator? Is the regulator's assurance good enough for us to trust the ISP? Now, of course, eventually I sort of noticed and dug into that and put in a freedom of information request. This is late in 2023, just before I joined the Centre for Independent Studies. And the freedom of information request asking for that consultation, that development, basically that occurred, exposed that there's a rule that was broken, but also that there was a long series of coordinated efforts of basically the market operator going to and asking for permission from the regulator to break this rule. And so the rule was broken. And this actually made front page news, right? So we wrote a press release of this. So on the 30th of January, this was published. It's called Clash Over Energy Roadmap Consultation in the Australian newspaper. And this is where basically the regulator first came out and started repeating in public what is now clearly false and is clearly a lie, right? So, and this has been said in many, many different ways. I'll just have to try to kind of, jumble them together. The essence is that there's a duplication, right? That one consultation is not required. And there's kind of two ways they spin that. They kind of say, oh, there's consultations that have gone before, all right, on all the inputs, right, the ingredients. Because they've consulted on the inputs, we don't really need to consult on the impact on the outputs. That's sort of kind of the same thing. That's a hand wavy step there, which is false, totally false. Or they sort of say, oh, like, we're already about to consult on the draft, all right? But that hasn't happened. And this update means that they can go away without those consultations being completed and literally start giving those final regulatory approvals that lets us start signing checks to big transmission companies, right? So this duplication claim, either way you look at it, whether the previous stuff amounts to a consultation or the stuff that's coming after, that hasn't been done yet, so it's totally irrelevant. This duplication claim is the essence of the falsehood, which I've now, having rolled it around so many times, trying to figure out whether there's any way that it could possibly be right. And it's not, and I'll give you more evidence of that. And any way that they didn't know what they were doing and that this was false, I've just decided in this video to sort of quit, trying to dance around and just call it what it is. It's a lie. So this is the first indication this falsehood was absolutely bitten down into clearly. All right, and they say there's no point. This is Claire Savage to the Australian, to the media. All right, there's no point in having additional duplicative processes just for the sake of it when there has already been an up-to-date, thorough consultation process that can be relied upon. Night and day, absolutely clear, totally wrong. That is not the consultation process that was required by the rules, and it is not, I think, her job to declare that either. We'll get to that later. And by the way, the FOIs also have revealed that this is not the first time this has occurred. This was also done in a previous 2 years before for the benefit of the same project. AEMO has already skipped a consultation, already breached the rules, and they've got permission from the regulator one time before. And when that occurred, the consumer panel, again, another one of these kind of organizations supposedly set up for transparency that the market operator refers to all the time and says, oh no, look, like we've got the consumer panel, all accountable. The consumer panel called this out as a significant weakness in the ISP process. They were basically as furious and fuming as anyone in official polite language would say, I think, about this step having been skipped. Significant weakness in the process. All right, so this has been done before. It's been called out by consumer representatives as being seriously, seriously bad. But the market operator is doing it again. Doing it again. Right after this project has had a massive cost blowout. And just at the point when this perfect, nice 82% new policy is being included that helps it limp over the line again. Does this build trust? Absolutely not. So anyway, that's the first instance of, I think, what is an absolutely clear lie. But that's not it. And again, the regulator, was questioned about this in what is an absolutely incredible series of questioning, multiple from different senators, by the way. But there's some that I'll focus on here. Questioned in Senate estimates, and again, I've just been through a bunch of parliamentary inquiries, and they always say, this is a legal proceeding of the parliament, false and misleading information is a serious offence, etc., etc. Repeating a falsehood or something misleading to Parliament should be taken seriously. All right, and so again, challenged by Senator Van, who read her the rule. He read her the rule. Must consult on new information and the impact on the optimal development path. Right. Read the rule. Plain English. Anyone that can read that knows that that's what the consultation requirement is. And she says, "I'm aware of that. Thank you." All right. Clearly, this is not taken by surprise. Aware of that, thank you. And again, it's part of the reason, I've written this on X before, you can go back and find it, that I think it's completely infeasible to argue that she doesn't know what she's talking about. She said she's aware of what the rule says. And she repeats the description of what happened and the argument, right? And so summarizing this letter exchange, she says, in both those occasions, they wrote to us, they as AEMO, and said, look, we think that consultation process has been done. And we wrote back and said, yes, we acknowledge that you have done that consultation process. That is false. That is blatantly false. The consultation that's required on the impact of the latest new information on the optimal development path in both cases has not been done. That statement is absolutely false. Right, now, and here is perhaps a critical turning point. Senator Van comes back with an absolutely perfect response. He says, but the difference between the draft ISP or the final ISP and the ISR is the ISR is modeling on and consulting on inputs into the system, whereas the ISP is about the output, what the optimal development path is. And he elaborates a little bit. But that's the key thing. He has called the bluff, absolutely called the bluff of the market operator and the falsehood, exposed the falsehood of this whole exchange between the market operator and the regulator. Absolutely called it out. This is checkmate. There's no way out of this. You can only escape a checkmate if you start breaking the rules. And that's what happens here. And you can see, I urge you to watch the footage, it's amazing, but you can see basically here, this is the last point that I think that there could be forgiveness for the lie, all right? If it had been acknowledged there and walked back, I think that all well and good. But then Ms. Savage, Claire Savage, the chair of the regulator, says, my understanding, and turning to the deputy or the chief executive, my understanding, and Miss Jolly might want to add to this, is, and then goes on and tries to rehash in a dozen different ways that are complex and wishy-washy, sort of basically the same thing, saying, oh, it's all kind of the same, the inputs, the output doesn't matter much. And they go on. And then she says, but didn't you want to add to that, Ms. Jolly? And at that point there, and that's why I'm naming Ms. Jolly as well, I think your resignation is required. At that point there, all right, when the complete falseness of the claim of your superior has been called out perfectly in Parliament, all right, you can say you have nothing to add. You can say you don't really know. But instead she said this. She said, I think that's correct. And then carried on, trying to again obscure and fumble what is, the truth. Muddy the waters. It is absolutely clearly false. Now, as well as that, not only do they, I think, make an absolutely clear misleading statement to Parliament, meant to be serious, but they also made this claim multiple times over. It's within our right to do that under law, all right? So that's what Claire Savage said several times over, basically asserting that their right to kind of do whatever she did, say it's okay to skip this rule, that you don't need to comply with this rule. It's within their rights to do that under law. Now, that struck me as strange. I didn't see that as obviously sort of, the case. And anyway, the Centre for Independent Studies went and got a legal opinion to check that and to see whether that's the case, all right? And this, again, it forms part of why there is just no point calling this anything other than a lie, because this has been tendered as an attachment in a bunch of submissions. We put all the submissions about this argument about why the ODP and the impact is different. So it's been tendered so many times, right? But just to give you highlights, and this submission with this legal opinion is available to anyone. James Glisson, KC, said, no such consultation was undertaken. It's not to the point that an earlier different consultation with other stakeholders may have covered the same or similar issues and topics. The law required the consultation mandated by the rule. It was not undertaken, and the decision is at best voidable or perhaps void ab initio as a result. No discretion for AER to forgive such a breach can be found in the legislation. No rule is formulated to supersede the duty imposed on AER, which was to enforce compliance by AEMO with the forecasting best practice guidelines, which is the specification about how long that consultation should be. Like, this is damning stuff. I could quote from this opinion all the time if you want, all right? The duty of the AER is to ensure that the rules have been complied with both in spirit and in the letter of the law. The most direct contradiction from a legal authority of exactly what Claire Savage has said to the Parliament, all right? Again, that discretion does not appear to exist other than in the mind of the regulator. it is not to be found in the legislative instruments. So this just gets, I think, worse and worse. And by the way, what happened is that we did issue a press release. We tried to sort of say to everyone, this seems like there's an issue going on here. This was flagged at the time. On the very same day that we issued a press release, there was a huge other story that broke, which was the story about the chief of ASIO declaring that a Chinese agent was trying to groom or turn a politician or influence them, and absolutely no political correspondent or anyone with any interest to pay any notice whatsoever, which is a bit disappointing. But this has been put on the record, all right? I won't try to labour all the other points in between, but since then, since all this has been made very clear in a bunch of submissions, you can look them up on the website at Centre for Independent Studies. Basically, things have been written back, and Stephanie Jolly, who's the Executive General Manager, wrote back with her signature on a letter to me. And this was actually in response to a letter that I'd sent at the very, very start. As soon as I saw that there was going to be a breach or a skipped consultation, I pointed out and requested the market operators, I requested the regulators' assistance in upholding the rules. And I said, this rule should be enforced. Can you please uphold the rules? They, of course, just missed that correspondence, apparently, which they've apologised for. But in their further, later, eventual statements, even after that, I think, damning opinion from James Glisson has been made available very publicly, continue to reiterate that basically, they've tried to make it out they did not excuse or did not provide any waiver. All right, it's a technical argument. Oh no, we didn't forgive, we didn't provide a waiver. They just looked the other way. All right. And I think it's just as shocking. And by the way, it's just as clearly contradicted by the arguments put forward by James Glisson, right? Like, the duty of AER is to ensure the rules have been complied with both in spirit and in the letter of the law. I cannot see how that has been done in this case. And furthermore, again, these statements include that appeal to the duplication argument, which is just false. Absolutely false. All right, so the mind boggles. Trust is so substantially breached, right? I won't go through every other kind of instance of things that they have done and said here along those lines. But I think that maybe just to kind of cap this off and tell you where it's ended and why I think now is the right time to basically point this out and say enough's enough and call out a lie for a lie. And that is that when we put in yet another submission, I think that with attachments, our submission was about 60 pages on HumeLink to the EPRA, the Energy Planning Regulation Australia Select Committee. We repeated, of course, this argument to say that basically the rules were not properly enforced. And the AER took it upon themselves to write a response, basically to call out, I'm not sure what it's called, basically, we believe that the CIS submission mischaracterises many aspects of our role that are focused on addressing key inaccuracies, right? So they have bitten back. They have said, no, we would like to argue and plead our case here, plead our case once more, that is a mischaracterisation, all right? And they have one point. They have one point, and again, there's 1,000 different ways I dive off on tangents here. They have one point that on a technicality in one of our submissions, it is said, we say that we put in an inserted brackets explanation, our words saying, waiving the mandated consultation, which is what we're describing what those letters seem to be, this exchange of letters that said like, oh, it's okay if you're not to do that, or carry on, good luck then, right? And their response is the AER does not waive obligations under national electricity laws, nor did we sanction a rule breach. I just honestly can't see how to take this seriously anymore. Like, if waiving is a technical term, like, if a waiver has a specific nuanced legal meaning, then absolutely correct, fair enough, all right? It wasn't a waiver. But then what was it? Like, this is very carefully orchestrated agreement to selectively enforce the rules at the request of the person that was about to not comply with them. Like, what do you call that? Like, and this is why I think it's just so important to basically sort of call this out, right? Like, the trust is broken. If you don't think it's a waiver, like how else would you describe it? What on earth is it? When you write a letter to an organization, basically, that's it. Can we break the rules? And you say, yes, okay, carry on. We don't mind that. What exactly is that? Something terribly bad is going on at that point. And one more time, they basically reassert the duplicative narrative in that letter as well. They say it again, and they said, like, we've acknowledged their approach that an additional round of consultations would be duplicative. I'll tell you what, there is absolutely no chance that an additional round of consultations would be duplicative. Absolutely no chance. And we know this beyond any shadow of a doubt, right? Like, the falseness of that statement has been proven in yet another way, if you want it, by, thankfully, the Australian Energy Market Commission. All right, this is the rule-making body. They're the only, I suppose, kind of, if you like, higher authority on what the rules do and say. And in fact, the right thing for the regulator to do, by the way, if they thought a rule was duplicative, would be to submit a rule change request and say, hey, Market Commission, would you please change this rule for us? All right. But instead, what they've done is claim they have the authority to selectively enforce in this way and sort of give what I think in spirit becomes a waiver, even if they think there's a technical way they can argue otherwise. The Market Commission wrote back to the Senate Select Committee into Energy Planning and Regulation in Australia in response to a question taken on notice on the 23rd of October 2024 from Senator Canavan. He was clarifying exactly this process, the consultation on the optimal development path. All right, and he's asked for clarification, and the response from the Market Commission is the AEMC agrees that an ODP, optimal development path, has not been consulted on at the time of publication of a draft ISP. All right. So on one hand, the regulator saying, we think that consultation has been done. And on the other hand, you have the Market Commission saying, we agree that that has not been consulted on at that time. This is perfect and complete contradiction of the narrative that the regulator has maintained again and again and again. And I just don't think there's any way of calling it anything other than a lie. It looks and feels very much the same as what happened in Senate estimates with Matt Keane saying the counterfactual. No, I'm sure they've tested that. Just not true. Just not true in this case. Oh, look, it was duplicative. We said, you've done that. Just not true. It was not done at that time. How many times can you repeat with greater confidence something that is just not true and expect people to just take it lying down and say that's okay? And so there you have it. I think that there is not a doubt at all that the regulator has not just failed to enforce a rule at the request of the market operator in a way that is clearly in the benefit of Transgrid, who are clearly in line to directly benefit at exactly this moment from this 82% renewable energy policy, which is part of that new information, the impact of which must be consulted on the ODP. At exactly that point, the energy regulator has decided to persistently and repeatedly lie to stakeholders about why they thought that was okay. There's so much more, by the way. There's a whole freedom of information request, a couple actually that are with the Information Commissioner at the moment. We know, for example, that it was actually the regulator's suggestion to the market operator that they request for this permission to get to skip the consultation. I won't go through all the details, but basically the substantive stuff, and I think that another layer of damning proof of this lies in redacted comments that we've been trying to get unredacted. I hope the Information Commissioner sees how important this is for public policy to have the truth about this. And so this, I think, is devastating. I think it's shocking. And I think that because of this kind of behaviour, we cannot trust any instance where the market operator says, oh no, this is fine, trust the regulator. Sorry. Same again. The trust is broken. Broken in ways that I don't think one more explanation, one more letter, one more attempt to re-explain the same thing to a Senate committee can possibly fix. This has gone too far. Genuine acknowledgement of how bad this looks, lying persistently about your failure to enforce and your reasons for failing to enforce a rule is absolutely unacceptable, I think. Absolutely unbecoming conduct for a regulator. And just a couple of minor little points to fill this in. This is not the only instance where the regulator has failed to do their duty on HumeLink, on exactly this approval process, right? They have a duty to assess the timing, the likely timing, the completion of the project. That's under 6A 8.2 brackets E brackets 1 brackets III. All right, and they have not done that clearly, because their own commission report on the likely timing says that Transgrid's own assessment of the timing says they've got a less than 1% chance of meeting the targeted deadline that they've just got approval and funding for to meet. All right, so they're being paid early to deliver late. There's not a chance. There's not a chance that the timing that's been approved by the regulator is reasonable. And the rules require them to only accept the proponent's decision, or rather they must accept it if it is reasonable. It's clearly not reasonable. Less than 1% chance. Most likely delivery the better part of 2 years late. It's like 500 days or something like that. It's absolutely enormous. So that's another concrete failure to do what the rules require for the good of consumers, to make sure we're not paying early for something that couldn't be delivered on time. Like, it just seems that this is crystal clear. And there's another case as well, the duty to assess the project as we start dishing out more interim tranches of funding. At each stage, the regulator's own guidelines actually require that they reassess on the basis of the whole cost of the project and the latest cost. And they have absolutely failed to do this. And it's been actually reasserted or reclaimed by them that the right thing to do was to only assess on the new bit of funding that was requested and not the cost of the whole project. It fails to live up to what is clearly stated in their own guidelines. I think that that guideline I will put a link to in the show notes. But this is not an isolated incident. We are forced to question and allow these facts. Can we trust that the regulator is actually doing their statutory duty properly? Can we trust that they're looking out for the long-term interest of energy consumers in this case? And when they're failing to enforce rules that are put there for the benefit of consumers, that absolutely would have pushed back this project, this HumeLink project, which I've already called for resignation on, and they lie about it, we cannot trust the energy regulator either. The trust is deeply, deeply broken. And I'll continue in the next video, hopefully not too late, not too far away, about why the actions of the Market Commission, who make the rules, also continue in the same theme, that the trust is also deeply broken there. Thanks, guys. Catch you soon.